The question is, which modeling method measurably outperforms the other? Because if we say, well, this is so complicated and there's black swans and there's intelligent adversaries and you can never get all the variables, well, no model captures all of that. None of them will. Even the most advanced quantitative models won't capture all of that, but it's better than many alternatives. That's the standard we should think about.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership with one of the contributors to my latest book, the #1 best-selling CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, as well as from other top CISOs and cybersecurity thought leaders. Listen to previous CISO Stories episodes at securityweekly.com/CSP. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Doug Hubbard, President and CEO at Hubbard Decision Research. It's great to be here today with Doug Hubbard, and we're going to be talking about risk today, but I'm curious, Doug, what brought you into wanting to look at cybersecurity risk?
Well, actually, that was based on analytics. My plan was to write a series of books with the How to Measure Anything theme. Difficult quantitative methods, or actually difficult measurement problems that simple quantitative methods actually address. My first one was called How to Measure Anything, and my second one was called The Failure of Risk Management. And they were both kind of experiments about which title would catch on better. And so How to Measure Anything, I think probably because it says how to in the beginning, and it has this ambitious sounding goal of measuring anything. That one did well. And so I decided what should be the next How to Measure Anything book. And I looked at how to measure anything in healthcare, how to measure anything in project management, how to measure anything in innovation, how to measure anything in cybersecurity, and 2 or 3 other ones. And so we did all these analytics on book ranks on Amazon of books on different topics and books on different types of titles on topics, how frequently certain terms are searched on Google Trends, and how frequently the terms show up on Ngram. And also a survey. We did a survey about which things people would. Cybersecurity was actually a very close tie with project management. But an enthusiastic co-author is what tipped the needle. So Richard Searson said, hey, if you're doing that, I'll be your co-author on the cybersecurity one. And now I'm actually starting the How to Measure Anything in Project Management.
Well, so I know the how-to is a great way to start a book. As an author myself, and when I was writing the CISO Compass book and looking at different titles, I was thinking about things like how to be a chief security officer, or things like that, because that's how people that's how people search. Right. And we came up with a different name, which has worked out really well. But it's so great to have somebody with your background in statistics, because there's a lot of us that play statisticians on TV, but aren't really statisticians in the cybersecurity world. So what's wrong with cybersecurity and how we measure risk today?
Yeah, I mean. Somebody just asked me last week, do I need a PhD in statistics to do this? And I said, well, I don't have one. I've got 2 PhDs on staff, but neither one of them are statistics. One's decision analysis, which is pretty close, actually. And the other one is cognitive neuroscience, and everybody else is applied math people. So they're all pretty good at statistics. But we've got lots of clients that have been doing statistical methods with a variety of backgrounds, theater majors and people like that. I think they're doing brilliantly. The trick is we have to kind of get past some of the obstacles that people have. There really are some relatively simple approaches where if we give somebody a template spreadsheet with fill-in-the-blank kinds of things, they get an answer, all right? And they shouldn't be put off by the perception of complexity or uniqueness. People might think this is uniquely complex or uniquely difficult to measure. And I hear that from cybersecurity people. They'll talk, there's nothing as complicated as cybersecurity because of the kinds of things that we do. And our aerospace R&D clients would say, there's nothing as complicated as radar engineering or aerodynamic modeling because we have to keep up with the enemy and they're doing all sort of stuff. And they have intelligent adversaries. Have you heard that one before? That one's apparently unique to aerospace too, right? Just as it's unique to cybersecurity. We have clients in pharmaceuticals and artificial organs. Nothing's more complicated than that. Well, we don't have to actually model everything with completeness to do better than their current model. That's the benchmark. How much better do we have to do to be better than the current methods they're using? If somebody says this is too complicated to model, well, you're modeling it now. You have a model. That's a given. Your intuition is a model. Your judgment is a model. Astrology is a model. It doesn't really matter, right? The question is, which modeling method measurably outperforms the other? Because if we say, well, this is so complicated and there's black swans and there's intelligent adversaries and you can never get all the variables, well, no model captures all of that. None of them will. Even the most advanced quantitative models won't capture all of that, but it's better than many alternatives. That's the standard we should think about. And I think a lot of people in cybersecurity, it's not unique to cybersecurity, but it does come up in cybersecurity, make a kind of error that we call the ex supero ursus fallacy in the books. Ex supero ursus is Latin for beat the bear. And that's based on that joke. Mm-hmm. Two guys are getting ready to go hike in the woods. One guy's got running shoes on. His buddy says, why are you wearing running shoes? We're going hiking. He says, well, I heard there were bears in the woods today. I wanted to be able to run faster if I needed to. The guy with the hiking boots says, well, that's absurd. You cannot run a bear anyway. The guy with the running shoes says, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. The guy in the hiking boots was making a kind of fallacy. He was committing a fallacy because he thought the objective was to beat the bear. No, it's just to beat the bear's alternative meal. Well, there actually is some research on this that's called algorithm aversion. So this is a phenomenon that's observed in people's thinking. If you reward people for forecasting something, so these experiments have been done where they reward people for making various forecasts, and in these experiments, they give people choices about, would you rather use this algorithm as kind of a benchmark to, adjust from, or would you rather use this human expert to adjust from? So either one, you can use them as kind of a coach to help you. And people might choose the algorithm, they might choose the human expert. But what the researchers observed is after you make a bunch of predictions and then you start getting some errors, the algorithm was making less frequent and smaller errors than the human experts, but people were much more willing to abandon the algorithm in favor of the human expert than the other way around once they started watching the errors occur. In other words, they were just more forgiving of errors from the human intuition, than they were of the algorithm. They were effectively holding the algorithm to a higher standard. And I see this all the time. I see people look at a quantitative model and they think of a black swan event and say, how well did that predict 9/11? How well did that predict COVID? Well, how well did you predict it? Mm-hmm. All we had to do is beat the alternative model. And if the alternative model is people's opinions and intuitions, even experienced ones, well, it turns out that those are easy to beat. And there's a lot of research on that.
I like in your book, which I happen to have right here, that you talked about this one story about where it was a 2010 study that they asked the CFOs of what the annual earnings would be in the S&P 500, and they said that they had a 80% confidence factor, but they were actually only right 33% of the time.
Oh, sure, right.
Which is a huge failure rate. But we go, and these are smart CFOs of the S&P, of the top companies. But do we tend to get overconfident?
Yeah, well, actually, that percentage is right in the ballpark of typical overconfidence percentages. So if people are asked for 90% confidence interval, so a little wider than 80%, I guess, but if they're asked for a 90% confidence interval on average on a variety of topics, they'll get somewhere around 40 or 45% of the correct answers between their upper and lower bounds. This could be estimating the outcomes of sporting events like a total score, or estimating, temperature the next day, or estimating the S&P 500, or estimating how long a project will take, or how much you would lose if you had a major cyber attack or something. Yeah, when you actually track those over time and you ask people for what's the interval that is wide enough that you think there's a 90% chance that the correct answer will fall between it, people are consistently overconfident. The good news is they can be trained not to be. And so there's actually adjustments we can make. It takes about a half a day, but most people, after half a day of training, are about as good as a bookie at putting odds on things. And bookies are pretty good. That's been measured, actually. You know who else is really good?
So what are some of those learnings that help improve that estimation process?
Oh, well, first off is feedback. How many times in your life have you put probabilities on things and then waited for feedback and then tracked how closely the probabilities matched observed frequencies? So you estimate a bunch of probabilities for a project finishing on time. And you say, oh, there was 100 times I said a project was 70% likely to finish on time, and it finished about 70% of the time, about 70 out of 100. And in fact, there were 20 times where I said that there was a 90% chance of the project finishing on time, and lo and behold, 18 of the 20 finished. Well, how long have people can go their whole career and not get that much feedback? Not on probabilities. They might have gotten feedback on other things, somebody gives you feedback on a presentation you just did or something, or how well a report turned out or something like this. But are you actually tracking probabilities and then getting feedback on the they're probably not even asked for probabilities in the first place. That's the first one. But even if they are asked for probabilities, when would they get feedback even if it was tracked? If you said that something was 5% likely per year to occur in your organization, of say a cyber breach or something, and I said, no, I think it's more likely than that. I think it's 20%. Well, how long do we wait before we figure out which one of us is closer to reality?
Could take 20 years, right?
Well, it's not going to be right away. I mean, you find out a little bit each year. Actually, when you do the Bayesian updates, that moves the needle each year. Actually, it moves it every day a little tiny bit. So every day it doesn't happen, we move the needle a little bit on both of those. Which one is more likely to be right, it turns out. But you're not going to find out right away, assuming we even tracked it to begin with. More likely, you said it was 5%, I said it was 20%, and then 2 years later, we forgot we ever said it. That's more likely, it seems. I think cybersecurity experts, like in most other fields, make far more estimates and forecasts than they recall making. They just don't document and track them. So if you don't do that, you can't learn. That makes sense. How do I learn without feedback? In order to learn from feedback, and this has been studied, you have to have consistent, immediate, unambiguous feedback. That's how you learn. If you only get feedback a small fraction of the time, it's inconsistent, you're not going to learn. If you get highly delayed feedback, feedback months or years later, you're not going to learn. And if it's ambiguous feedback, like if I said the risk was moderate, well, now a few years went by, was I right or not? I have no idea, right?
So to that point, a lot of organizations use the high, medium, and low heat map type matrices to try to make it into understandable terms for the board or other executives. Is that a good approach, or should we be doing something different and moving more towards the quantitative method?
Quantitative, yeah. I say completely abandon it. You don't need a risk matrix. It doesn't help. Any perception that it does help is an analysis placebo. It's adding error. Now, that's another case that's a particular example where there's been a lot of research on the efficacy of not just risk matrices, but even how well we use scales subjectively and so forth, even when we use intervals for continuous values, like we take impact monetized, for example. It could be safety or something else, but let's take monetized impact, and you divide it up into arbitrary increments or bins. And then you do the same thing with likelihood. You divide that up into arbitrary increments and bins. There's been a bunch of research on this, but error gets added just by that. And one of the errors that gets added is a function of something called partition dependence. People tend to distribute their answers, their responses in a certain way on a 5-point scale. Mm-hmm. And you might think the way that you carefully defined each of those intervals, that's going to influence people's judgments. Well, less so than you might think, actually. No matter how you define those, you'll find that people more likely actually still distribute their answers a certain way. You're hoping that they read this and they make their judgments. Maybe they're anchoring on the 5 points or something like this. And maybe they kind of forget about it after a while, or they think, well, I haven't used a 1 in a while. Maybe this one should be a 1. I haven't, they're not even looking at how they're defined. That's just the reality. It's called partition dependence. It's been studied to death. Also, there's other things like it's called the illusion of communication. When you use verbal labels for those intervals, it turns out that different users will interpret those labels very differently. So what does unlikely mean and what does likely mean? Well, there was a big study with a bunch of NATO officers reading intelligence reports, NATO intelligence reports. And apparently, unlikely meant lots of things to different people. It meant anything from less than 5% to more than 30%. Likely and probable could have meant 30% up to 90%. It was a matter of context in which they were reading it, and they believed they agreed. So you and I are having this risk assessment, and we both end up saying that the likelihood is somewhat likely. That's actually a term I've seen, somewhat likely. And the impact is a 4. And therefore, the risk is a moderate or yellow. And we go, well, we agree. We came to the same conclusion. We discussed it. We both agree. So let's call it a yellow. Well, we actually mean completely different things. The problem is that the language is so ambiguous that it allows us to believe we're communicating.
Does it help?
That's what the illusion of communication is.
If we use like a hybrid approach with that, where we're affixing those ranges to what a high, a medium, low likelihood impact means in terms of dollar value or impact?
The best thing to do, I mentioned this in the book, they can go straight to, in fact, you don't have to buy the book to do this. You can go straight to the book's website at howtomeasureanything.com and go to click on the cybersecurity book. And the first thing there is called the 1-for-1 substitution. The 1-for-1 substitution is a spreadsheet where you can do a Monte Carlo simulation using subjective inputs, just like you would have used a risk matrix. But you're going to skip the scores and scales and stuff. You're just going to put an annual probability of some event in. So you say, all right, what's the chance per year that this event occurs? Don't bias anybody with the scores and the partitions. Is it 10%? Is it 25%? Is it 2%? Do that. Put that in. So I say it's 10% likely per year. What's your 90% confidence interval for the impact if it does happen? Well, I think it's 1 million and 10 million. Now that might have straddled a couple of intervals in a previous thing, but I think it's 1 million, 10 million. The next one might be even wider. It might have straddled even more intervals in some arbitrary previous definition. Now, in that model, it's a table, and every row in that table, you're just identifying a risk, you put an annualized probability on it, and a 90% confidence interval for an impact. It happens to follow a log normal distribution. I talk about that in the book. But you completely skip the risk matrix. If you have a risk matrix, every dot on the risk matrix can become a row on that table. And even if you're only doing it subjectively, so you don't have to spend any more time on it than you did on the risk matrix. You just identify the risk like you were on the risk matrix, and instead of saying the likelihood is a 2 or an unlikely or the impact is a moderate or a 3, just give a probability and put an interval on it. Now, that seems like that's pretty simple, and it is really simple, and it seems like, well, you're still just subjective, so it's not any better. That's wrong. That's actually incorrect. Some subjective methods measurably outperform others, just by virtue of the fact that the method itself doesn't add sources of error. That's what the risk matrix actually does. It adds sources of error that didn't exist with the unaided intuition. We're actually doing this survey right now for the next book, the How to Measure Anything in Project Management. And we're looking at risk in projects. So we're gathering this survey data about risk in projects. And we also ask them what kinds of methods they're using. Are they using Monte Carlo simulations? Are they using risk matrices? Are they using PERT charts and Gantt charts, or Agile or Lean Six Sigma? We're asking all these sorts of things. And one of the strongest signals we're getting already from the survey that we get is that, yeah, if you use Monte Carlos, you're more likely to be on time and on budget. That's number one. Risk matrices don't seem to hurt or help at all. But what's interesting is that when people say they're using risk matrices, the things that they list as bad things that happened during the project, a vendor went bankrupt or something like this, or inclement weather, affected things. Those were not unpredictable things in any quantitative model. We have plenty of reasons to believe those are risk. You don't have to be surprised every time. Of course, inclement weather can affect a long construction project that takes 2 years. Why wouldn't that be in the model? And of course, if you've got 200 vendors working on a big, giant, collaboration on building some new football stadium or something, yeah, one of them can go bankrupt. Is it one that's going to be a critical path for finishing something? Well, why be surprised by that? We know those things happen. Mm-hmm. The same thing happens with cybersecurity. You've got everything all set up. It's all perfect. Should I be surprised that I have a disgruntled employee who had admin level access who ruins things before he leaves or she leaves? Why be surprised about it? We know it's happening.
So how should a CISO approach this with data, being difficult to get because we don't tend not to share our vulnerabilities across companies very easily.
Sure.
How should the CISOs be approaching their risk management programs?
Yeah, well, here's the first thing to realize, though. If you lack data, the risk matrix in no way alleviates that problem. It simply makes you feel better about it. There is a phenomenon that I ended up calling analysis placebo. That wasn't the term that the original authors who discovered it used, but I found these different authors in completely different fields. They don't even cite each other. They're not aware of each other's research. They were each looking into the performance of different kinds of methods and data gathering and structured approaches to estimation and decision making on very different problems, estimating the duration of projects, the outcomes of sporting events, the performance of investment portfolios, the guilt or innocence of criminal suspects. In each of these areas, they were doing this analysis, and they would adopt the decision makers would adopt these various methodologies that seemed structured and formal. And what the researchers found is that confidence always went up. But it went up even when measured performance was worse than it was before. In fact, in all of these studies, none of them showed the method they were using was an improvement. They were all either no improvement at all or worse, but everybody got more confident. So that's why I say the risk matrix is an analysis placebo. I know the CISO feels better after using it. No one's doubting that. But when you measure its actual performance and look at the research on all the components, the scales, the scores, the partitions, the range compression, the rank reversal that's been discovered in different, we find rank reversal examples every time we ever look at these things. All of those are problems that are introduced by the risk matrix. And no problem about lack of data or uncertain capabilities of threats or changing technology, none of that is alleviated in any way by the use of a risk matrix. So if you lack data, don't add more error to your subjective estimates. Simply get calibrated. If you really don't have any data, which is not usually the case, right? There's really quite a lot of data. But at least get calibrated so you're good at assessing your own uncertainty, and then use that as your basis for estimating the likelihood of an event and the likely impact of the event. I would add a couple of other things, though. So you do have more data than you think, and you probably need less data than you think. These are surprising outcomes when you look at statistics and what's available out there, but they're really maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago when we first started doing some cybersecurity models, people might have been justified by saying, yeah, we don't have a lot of data. Actually, you do have a lot of data now. With the IRIS report from Scientia, the Veris database, the DBIR from Verizon, the National Vulnerability Database, et cetera. Each one of these areas, there's data there. You have to know what to do with it in order to compute things like make an inference about the probability of a breach or a ransomware attack or something like this. It doesn't tell you that explicitly, but you can use that data to compute those things. We really do have quite a lot of data there. Even knowing the number of employees you have tells you something about your chance of a data breach. More employees means higher chance for a few different reasons. Each employee is kind of like another risk in an organization, but also it means if you have a lot of employees, it means you're a bigger target, that kind of stuff. So you really do have quite a lot of data. I'm always telling people, don't give up so fast on this claim that you have no data. Think about it a little bit longer. There's this quote in the book, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. He said, might be paraphrasing a little bit. He said, a genius is just somebody who will spend 20 minutes trying to figure out something that most people give up on immediately. There you go. Mm-hmm. Instead of just assuming you have no data, think about it a little bit longer. You have an important job as a CISO. People are depending on you. You're making big decisions about big risk. Spend a little bit more time thinking about how to be resourceful with what data you might have out there that you didn't first think of in the first 30 seconds. Okay, so you have plenty of data.
Well, Doug, this has been very interesting. I know we could talk a long time about this because risk is really the bread and butter of a CISO to determine in their organizations. So what final advice would you give to CISOs as they're going down this journey of trying to figure out the risk within their organizations?
Yeah, I have these kind of do's and don'ts I tell everybody right away, which is, first off, get realistic about what you think the measurable performance is of the methods you use. There's nothing that says that those risk matrices or qualitative methods of any kind add any value other than a pure placebo effect. It just makes you feel better. It's not that hard to make the leap into a simple simulation model on an Excel spreadsheet that everyone can download for free. howtomeasureanything.com/cybersecurity, or just click on the cybersecurity book on howtomeasureanything.com and download the very first thing. There's instructions right on it. It's still subjective, that version, but once you adopt the quantitative modeling approaches, well, then you get a lot of powerful tools you can use to improve your subjective estimates. Now we can use data. I don't know how to use data to update a moderate risk or a 2 on a likelihood scale or something like this. I don't know, what's the math for that. But if you tell me that something has a frequency of between 0.2 and 0.8 times a year, and the cost is 1 million to 5 million, and I see a few data points, or even go another year without the event occurring, can I do the math to update that? Well, yeah, actually there is math to update that. There's even math for further improving the subjective judgments of experts, because we know they're consistently overconfident, so we can adjust that through training and some mathematical adjustments. And there's algorithms for combining multiple subject matter experts. In cybersecurity, just like in a lot of fields, you usually ask multiple experts. Well, how do I combine them? Do I just average them, or do I get them in a room and they all agree? Those aren't the best approaches, it turns out. The best approaches are some algorithms. They've been studied for decades now. There's some algorithms for doing that. We have our own algorithms that we've been testing now on all this calibration data, many thousands of data points we've had over many of the years here. And we know that if you can aggregate your experts the right way, the aggregated expert, we call it the Franken-SME, the Franken-SME is measurably better than your best individual SME. So why wouldn't you use the Franken-SME? That's your best expert, is the aggregation using the right formula of your existing experts. That's your best expert.
Well, this has been great. This is such a tough challenge to figure out, and I know, as we get into more materiality discussions with the SEC and trying to put dollar amounts towards our cyber risk, we're going to have to move away from the high, medium, and low to actually get to those answers, aren't we? So,
well, sure.
So thanks a lot, Doug. Thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Thanks a lot.